Hello, everyone. This is the SIG PM meeting for May 7th. This is a recorded meeting that will be live and on the internet afterwards. So please be mindful of what you say, and please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. So starting off, I want to open up the floor. We don't have much on the agenda, and it will probably be a free-flowing conversation. But I want to open the floor to anybody who's here who may have a topic that they want to talk about. So.
I just want to make a reminder that SIG PM has a face-to-face meeting space on Monday during the week of KubeCon in Barcelona. And we're going to have the face-to-face meeting at the Contributor Summit. So if you attended the Contributor Summit, please attend our session.
So that is the afternoon session for people who are going to the Contributor Summit. So that's, I believe, starting at 2 p.m. Barcelona time.
I have to recheck the schedule, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I recently put together my schedule, so I think that's correct. There's also the SIG PM intro and deep dive sessions for KubeCon. So if you're interested in going to those and talking to us outside of this meeting face to face, feel free to pop into those sessions. We'd love to see you there. Since the last meeting, we have had so the lazy consensus around the PM chairs has merged, as well as the changing of the mailing list. That change has merged too. So you can now reach us at Kubernetes-SIG-PM@googlegroups.com. There are a few action items from the last meeting, which I think honestly, everyone is prepping for KubeCon, so I've been a little under it. I know Ihor and Jace are probably under it as well. But those are, some of the things that are listed regarding tracking out of tree enhancements, stale enhancements, and what deprecation policies and graduation criteria for certain things are high priority for us, right? So once we get through the slog of prepping and executing on KubeCon, we'll be jumping back to those for 115. That said, we've got Claire DeWall here. Questions, concerns, comments, topics that you wanted to talk about? No.
So I would be interested in talking about the deadlines are horrible.
Yeah, deadlines are horrible. It was, yeah, so that's, so before we get into that, anyone else that had a topic that they wanted to bring up? All right. Okay, so deadlines are horrible, right? So Tim Hawkins sent out an email, I want to say maybe a week and change ago, regarding the enhancements freeze and the fact that enhancements freeze is now tied to the KEP's deadline, right? So there's a lot of interesting discussion there. So Tim, Brendan, Clayton Coleman, a few others chimed in, and what I was hearing from a lot of this is that reviewer bandwidth is incredibly low, and I think this is something that we've always known for the project, and it's something that we're constantly striving to fix, right? So buffing the API review process, buffing the owner's files across all of the sub projects, something that's constantly in motion. I think that there has not been attention paid to doing the same, treating KEPs as a sub-project, which they are, and doing the same for the owner's files within the KEP subdirectories. Right, so I mentioned that on the email. I've been going back over the email today, although I've been running back and forth to meetings to try to summarize, so it's easy for people to just read at a glance all of the things that people are having pain with. Right, so my top level list, what I've written down so far is we need more reviewers, approvers in general, and more specifically for KEPs, right? There is still significant back and forth between during the KEP review process, right? So this leads to churn and kind of burnout for people who are KEP authors, right? If and as well as the fact that the template was changed in the middle of the prior cycle, so there's a bunch of churn around that too. So being a little better about how we do reviews, especially for things that are provisional as opposed to implementable, right? I think I was also hearing that there's a feeling that we must, SIGs feel obligated to completely review all KEPs by the deadline, right? Instead of just the ones targeted for the milestone, right? So what that tells me is that there's a deeper planning problem, right, across all of the SIGs, right, where this deadline is treated as some hard date, right? For me, I consider the deadline to be, this is a date at which we want to get things in, or we want to have things in so that the release team's life is easier, right? Everything starts to fall apart for the release team if these things are not done by that date. Not fall apart, but with due diligence from each of the roles. Of course, I don't think we've ever had or I don't think we've had a recent off-target release, right? I think we've always hit our date, outside of holidays or whatever else has been going on, right? So I want to try to figure out a way to reframe this deadline as not a hard deadline, but more so, how can we help the release team, right? How can we as a community help the release team deliver high quality releases, right? And then from the SIG side, we need to see that, okay, like this is not from their perspective, it shouldn't be, oh my God, we have to review all the KEPs and get them to the stage by this date. It should be, we should always make sure that the KEPs that are coming into our subdirectories are of high quality and reviewed on a timely basis, right? That way, when the deadline comes around, it's not, oh my God, we have to do all the stuff. It's all of our stuff is already done because we've been doing it throughout the cycle in stages, right? So I think that part of that that lends to the deeper, we have a triage problem, right, across all of the repos, across all of the SIGs, right? And that's something that there are multiple threads and issues up for this at this point. I think one of the first fixes that we can do is there's a PR open to turn on some automation around a need SIG triage label, right? As well as retargeting some of the existing triage labels. So I think there's like triage unresolved and triage like won't fix and different things like that. So we need to, I believe Nico has put together quite a bit of a proposal that I need to reread about how to do some of these things during his experience as a bug triage lead and doing bug triage for the last few cycles. So that's something that I want to push on pretty heavily for 115, because I think if we can start to remove some of the bottleneck around how SIGs do triage in general, they realize that the KEP process is just more triage, right? It's handling stuff the same way you would any other issue or PR, right? So yeah, Jace.
Yeah, so I think two things. One is that we still need to do a KEP retrospective. And I would love to do it at the SIG level just to get SIGs, sort of giving us direct feedback. I think Tim's response was a proxy for some of that feedback. But we need to introduce some continuous improvement things to the process itself so we can get better fidelity feedback. Second thing is, I think, to use the analogy of the KonMari method of does this bring joy, I feel like we need to make sure that these KEPs bring the SIGs that are responsible for using them and doing them, and also the release team joy, that they have value, that everybody sort of sees and acknowledges, and it's like, wow, this thing is actually useful. And you know what I mean? Like right now, what we're suffering from is a feeling that there's a lot of process and overhead for what doesn't feel like any tangible value except for a very small amount of people. And so it's what is eventually going to happen is people will pitchfork and stop participating in it altogether, which is kind of a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
So my idea is just that we leverage feedback from the retrospectives that we conduct, and we can do it in email. I'd hope that we do it in person, but maybe we just need to do like a survey or something, even lightweight.
Yeah.
Some way to get feedback. And then Taylor, as a sub-project owner, like, is this sub-project actually bringing joy or not?
Yeah.
And how to fix it.
So for, for me at least, I considered the idea of a survey and didn't really want to do that, simply because even though like we're one of the few people who generate surveys or can generate surveys, but simply because that I don't want the the stuff that's kind of been rattling around in your head, in my head, in Caleb's head, and in Ihor's head, to provide any bias against like what's said, right? I do think that the face-to-face is the right idea. So I'm hoping that's and email forthcoming, but I would like as many SIG chairs as possible to crowd on to that face-to-face session for the contributor summit, and
Yeah,
then
maybe we could, like we talked about prioritizing
like
who
that.
was most impacted by the number of caps. Basically, we could try triage that way too, so we're not,
Yeah. So written down in my notes is like find keps that are, find the keps that are most stale, find the SIGs that had the most keps kicked out, the most enhancements kicked out of the previous release cycle, the ones that have the most currently open, and figure out if there's a way to target velocity of keps in general, right? And go to the ones that need attention, but also go to the ones that are getting them in, have the highest velocity, right? For ideas, right? If they're doing it right, maybe there's some vague template of what they do that makes them more successful. Like I can say, for a fact that, SIG cluster lifecycle, all of their keps are well organized by sub-project. They're in on time, right? So like they're doing something that people are not doing, and it's worth analyzing both the best cases and the worst cases right now. So some more of my notes was like, without so Brendan mentioned this in the email thread, that without a deadline we kind of lose the sense of urgency around the reviews, right? So right now the ones that are getting attention are the ones that get frequently pinged, right? Are the ones that people like care about for their deadline, and that almost informs kind of what the theme, at least for that SIG, is for the release, right? There was also some good feedback. Derek said, like, hey, I like, I like keps. I think people are deriving value from them. Just the current state that they're in, there's still this burden around doing reviews, the back and forth of doing reviews. And, Tim kind of echoed the back and forth of doing reviews. Like, have you ever tried to review something 3 times in the same day, right? And, like that kind of is madness, but, that's, part of the reason for that is because it's only gotten attention at the last minute, right? So I think this goes back to, if we had a framework for making sure things were happening continuously along the cycle, as opposed to just the week and a half, week before the deadline, I think we'd be more successful as a group around that, right? So what else was I hearing? Some may feel that their experiences are not sufficient to do reviews, right? So some of the people who are currently in owners files for KEPs may not feel that they are the people most appropriate to do the KEP reviews, right? Or do API reviews, right? And this again falls back to, we need to buff the list of reviewers and approvers for these things, right? And it's not a we thing; it's an everyone thing. This needs to be the SIG's responsibility to promote people to have that responsibility, right? Because if we continue along the lines of having SIG chairs and SIG technical leads as the only reviewers and approvers for these things, like, yes, it will continue to be the same oversubscribed people, on these email threads talking about this stuff. So, one thing to make clear is that KEP reviews are not equal to API reviews, right? So someone should feel comfortable reviewing potential enhancement for their sub-project or their SIG, right? Because by definition, they are the people responsible for doing the reviews and approvals for that SIG. Now, as we move into, okay, well, what does implementation actually look like, right? I think this is where the API review process comes into play, right? And I know things that are still evolving around what's happening with the API review process, but that is something that is at least well documented, right? It's well documented, and there's automation in place to flag people for API reviews and to mark an API change as requiring API review. So I think that, you know, if we're able to do one, make sure that it's very clear to people who do reviews that they are different processes, right? I think that will enable more people to feel comfortable actually doing the reviews for KEPs. Any questions, comments about any of that stuff so far? All right, cool. So what else? So submitting KEPs for newer contributors is still hard. KEPs could benefit from an onboarding process, right? I struggle to figure out exactly what that looks like. I think that, you know, for the most part, people who are writing KEPs are you know, have spoken to, they've gotten deep enough into the project at that point to, one, understand what a KEP is and that you may even need to write it. But what I'm hearing is that for newer contributors that realize that they need to do a KEP for, you know, potential enhancement, or maybe they don't even need to do the KEP. Maybe it's something that can be executed in one cycle and ties into some other functionality, right? That can just easily be referenced. Maybe they don't know that part, right? So I think that there's a significant burden on people who are trying to do this for the first time, and that's totally understandable. I think that, you know, there are people who have been trying to do this for the 10th time that still have trouble with it, because, like, I think it's, you know, I think where we're at right now is, you know, a lot of the process is still developing, right? You know, some of this is still a moving target. So
yeah, I was gonna add that the sort of default reflexive answer of it needs a KEP is not necessarily accurate either. I think we need to determine what actually is in scope for a KEP and not, and maybe there's some lightweight process that we can implement, you know, KEP Lite or something for things that are more informational that need project or some sort of management around it, but not necessarily the full KEP life cycle.
right. So I do think that that's a great idea, and I think that we, in the front of the repo, we basically say, like, your thing may need an enhancement if, right? And you know, so it's a question of, is that documentation in the right place? If it's not, let's get it to the right place. Are people seeing that and you know, and kind of filing a KEP for something that may not need a KEP anyway? You know, but you know, there are a lot of the KEPs that I've at least looked at. I can say I thankfully do very few KEP reviews, but I see all of the things flowing into enhancements just by way of watching the repo. So you know, I think a lot of the KEPs are appropriate, right? They're there. They just need love and attention, I think, from people in the SIGs, whether it's, you know, a designated KEP reviewer or a designated pool of KEP reviewers. If those are not going to be the SIG technical chairs or leads, or the other way around, right? But yeah, maybe I think maybe some of the things that we've written down could be in better places. I'm not sure. Maybe the group feels a certain way.
I think something interesting that I pulled out of a lot of this thread is it seems like the main bottlenecks are possibly like a lack of reviewers available, and then the other bottleneck is the amount of back and forth that happens. And I'm wondering if, like, around the amount of back and forth, if any of these KEP reviewers have been taking, maybe like keeping track of, like, what is the cause of some of this back and forth, like what was the information missing that caused this like loop of needing more feedback constantly. And if you can figure out like if there are patterns of like information that's frequently missing, if maybe we start putting that in some of the documentation of saying a lot of people find it useful. But
yeah, for sure. So I would say that would probably get valuable info from Kendrick on that stuff, since him and his team are doing reviews for reviews for the reviews of KEPs, essentially, reviews for the enhancement issues. I think I can say off the top of my head that I know there was some static caused by having the template shift in the last cycle, causing people to have to rewrite some of the stuff. There's also a lack of understanding around the states, right? A KEP in provisional status does not require the same level of detail, or does not need to adhere to the enhancement deadline, or doesn't need to adhere to the enhancement deadline if it's not going in tree Kubernetes, right? So those are some things right there that hang up KEPs, right? The release team not filling out the release team checklist. Someone asked me, oh, well, do I have to file an enhancement, an exception for this enhancement? And I was like, yes, it's past the due date. You have to file an exception for it. It's not complete. It's past the due date. I was like, I'm also not the one who approves these at all, right? I make sure I'm not part of that process. So there's some confusion there, and then kind of going back and reviewing what was added after pointing at the template and all that stuff. I saw that the release team checklist. The release team checklist was added to the KEP, but it was not filled out, right? I was like, this is so I had to go back and say, like, this is a checklist that needs to be filled out, right? It's not enough to just copy and paste the template of the checklist in. I was like, this is still missing a test plan. This has no idea of graduation criteria and so on and so forth. Another thing I've brought up a few times, and I realize it's actually on the future topics for SIG architecture and has been for some time. So we probably need to create an issue or start a mailing list thread to kind of start pushing this forward, is the fact that there is no global graduation criteria for the project, right? So every time someone writes graduation criteria for a KEP, they have to imagine what that's going to be, right? And then realize that there is no one standard to be held to, right? When they imagine what that graduation criteria is going to be, the person who reviews it is actually going to be the person who determines what that is, right? So that's going to be different to everyone, right? So that's a huge problem, right? So like we as a project, and more specifically SIG architecture, needs to provide concrete graduation criteria, right? That can be upheld as some template for each of the things that would go into Kubernetes, right? If we can do that, I think that will allay some of the confusion around how to file some of the data that goes into a KEP. So I need to sit down and actually write that up, because I mention it ever so often, and I think it's on a lot of people's minds, but we haven't had a chance to like sit down and really discuss it. But Claire, you're completely right. I think one of the things that you mentioned, like reviewers and approvers, like this is not a KEP specific problem. This is a problem that we have in the project, period, right? So it's a problem that needs attention paid, like across all SIGs. So I think that I'm trying to figure out who is the person or who is the group of people to figure out how to do that, and I think that it's individually on all SIGs to kind of figure that out. So
I think SIG architecture definitely is like the master holder of that. By governance, SIG architecture owns the deprecation policy. And so I think the graduation criteria fits into that as well. So that probably from the broad swath, that's where it starts. And then each of the SIGs probably has their areas of concern that they document. Like SIG node is going to have totally different criteria than some other SIG or SIG storage or whatnot. So maybe we're more facilitators, kind of like you're saying. Like we help guide the work, we help facilitate the discussions, but make sure that there's some commonalities so that people navigating the KEP process aren't trying to guess every time and trying to figure out and get different answers every time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because the UX around that is super sucks, and we have to be conscientious that we're actually the same people doing this work are the people we also need reviewing PRs and issues, and
yeah. So where's the line for them, right?
Right.
If they're burning energy valuable, very valuable energy to us. Defining what graduation criteria is, times however many KEPs they have to review, that's not something we should be doing.
100%. Yeah, I feel like we have this is our most precious commodity at this point, so we need to be very cautious how we use it.
Yeah. So I haven't gone. So I've read every email on the thread, but I haven't collated all of my thoughts. But the last two are, notifications around enhancement freeze could happen sooner, right? So this is, I think this is helpful to people who are reviewing KEPs, but I think that, the core problem is still KEPs should be a continuous process, right? It should not be we're looking at a deadline and saying, oh my God, this deadline is coming up. We've got to do all of this work. It should be to say, hey, the deadline's there. Like, do we have them flipped over to implementable? Cool, done.
Right? I think that's the value part too, right? If people work on them because they're giving value, then they're going to be invested in it the whole time. Yeah. If it's purely process for process sake, then they're going to save it till last minute. So I think that's one of the early leading indicators that we can use in terms of when we see people having KEPs life cycles maintained throughout the release process and it's not a mad rush, then it's like that's a key part where we feel like, yes, this is now a successful thing. So I think that as far as our success criteria, that should be part of it. So like some measurable number of KEPs, say 80% don't need any attention at all. They're just staying updated because the
SIG is actually interested in them. Yeah, for sure. So and then finally, for me at least, there needs to be a way of gaining visibility on inbound KEPs, right? And I think that some of this is solved with so Tim had mentioned, he's like, there were KEPs that I was reviewing that I didn't even know existed up until that point. Right. So, this bleeds back into how do we do issue and triage, issue and PR triage for the project period, right? So is there some signal, is there some dashboard that we can search that, that gives visibility into that stuff? And yes, there could be, there will be, hopefully, right? Coming eventually. So I think that, starting to put starting to put more labels and different things around this will allow us to automate some of these things. So the idea, at least for the Kubernetes repo would be, there's kind of like a process chart for, let me just find the issue, where, something would come in and, kind of the way it does right now, something comes in and it says like, needs SIG, needs priority, right? So the idea being that we add needs SIG triage, right? Or needs KEP review or some such, right? So on the Kubernetes repo, it'd be coming in as needs SIG triage, right? So that label would signify that a SIG has not seen it yet, right? There's also a question of, well, who is the primary SIG for a KEP or for an issue? Or for a PR, right? For all the KEP subdirectories that are configured or were configured by either a SIG chair or myself, they should have the appropriate SIG labels auto applied, right? So anyone submitting to those directories will get auto tagged, right? So a SIG searching for anything in K enhancements with their SIG label should be able to have a handle on the KEPs that are available to them. I think that additionally, people who are using project boards can start to create a separate column for KEPs in their project boards, right? So at least, there's something there for review. There's also mention of creating a Omni KEP board, right, where all of the KEPs are listed. And I'm trying to figure out, because this is, I'm trying to figure out if this is going to be a stopgap for, things that we want to do eventually, like, one of the things that we want to do eventually is drain the queue of all of the enhancement issues that currently exist, right? So if we put them up on a board, does that mean they're going to stay longer or shorter? Like, I think it's going to mean that they stay longer. So I'm a little hesitant to do that. Although I'm definitely open to people, like, the thing is, I don't want to put up a board and prioritize a board of 132 issues right now, for to say later that they're going away, right? I think that is kind of a waste of effort. So I think we need to figure out how we want to look at these things, and I think that it might be enough to have SIGs just put a column up for KEPs in their tracking boards to start, at least. Eventually, I would probably like to see something on the contributor site, which a separate section on the contributor site. So I've talked with George a little bit about this, having a KEP display view right on the contributor site, but this is it's tricky because, right, there are the KEPs that are merged, and then there are the KEPs that are PRs that are in flight, right? So this provides visibility to the things that would be merged, assuming that they are in some format that we can consume by automation, right? But for all of the things that are inbound, there still needs to be some separate process for those, right? So figuring out what that is, if people have ideas on that, happy to hear them. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking. I've been yammering for for a while. So
You do have a pleasant radio-like voice. I'm enjoying it. So
this week on SIG PM,
that's right.
Kubernetes After Dark.
Yeah, I think +1 to everything you're saying. I think one of the things that we suffer from is ambitious beginnings, and then there's a lot of things that have to be maintained after the fact. Project boards are a classic example. I mean, I've done this too. Like, oh my God, project board will make this so easy, but then it's like somebody has to live and die by that project board, and it's really hard. We are understaffed, so it's sort of like we're suffering from the same meta problem that reviewer bandwidth or anything else. We just don't have enough people.
Yeah, and I think that I think that we naturally gravitate to the things that we're interested in, or
Yes.
the things that we have purview over, right? So,
Yep.
I think Jace, you've initially handled the architecture ones, the API review, some of the conformance stuff, and you're probably still doing some of that stuff, as well as the maybe to a lesser extent the steering boards.
Yeah, I used to do that, but the idea is with boards is that whoever is the group that has it manages it.
Should own it, right?
And that's the thing, is the steering committee saw value in this board, and they walk the board and do all the things that they should because Aaron pushed it. He was like, we need to be using this as a backlog mechanism, and that's why it stuck. So somebody has to be the sort of scrum master, if you will, for the SIG to drive those things forward.
Yeah. So I think what we wanted to do eventually as part of our sub projects is have project management and basically ship people out to SIGs to help them handle their boards. But I very much think that those people need to be aligned and interested in what the SIG is doing to have the appropriate context, right?
Agreed. Ideally, it's somebody with the cross functionality experience. Somebody who enjoys storage and project management.
Exactly.
Those are some Venn diagrams that are really hard to come up with.
It's like one person just holding their fingers linked together. Yeah, but so it's like it's so like I'm happy to maintain the PM boards and the KEP board, KEP implementation tracking board, right? And I recently did I ran into the SIG release, the release team meeting on Monday and said, like, we have boards, use them, they're required now. Everyone must board. And Claire was like, oh, cool, okay. But just going through, I think there's a point where we don't even understand like the at times like the magnitude of some of the things that are in this project, right? Some of like what the backlog actually looks like. So it was a really interesting exercise for SIG release, at least, to put together, so at first I was like, okay, SIG release, one board, I'm just gonna, search the SIG release label and drag everything in. By the time I was like, I think a quarter of the way through, I was like, this is getting kind of ridiculous. And, we ended up with 130 issues on that backlog. And I was like, that no one's going to look at this board. And then broke it up into sub-project boards, right? So there's one for release team, for release engineering, for licensing, and then a top-level SIG board. And even still after doing that, there were 99 issues on the top-level SIG release board, right? So it's like it's such an indicator of like there are things that we don't even know we're supposed to be tracking, right? I was surprised. I would have thought our number total across sub-projects was closer to 50 to 60, right? So to see that it was almost twice the amount, like, is a very scary thing. So so I'm going to be like mentioning on the SIG release call today, like, hey, we need to, like, I need everyone to start looking at these things and trying, from the sub project owner standpoint, like, treat that as your baby and try to walk that during each of your meetings, right? I think that the release team is an interesting case, at least because they work in quarterly cycles, right? So so what will often happen is that a bunch of people will be assigned to issues to kind of try to drive those down within that milestone, and then when they're no longer on the release team, those issues are still assigned to them, right? So is it the job of the person who was previously on the release team to finish out the issue that they were assigned, or that they decided to take up? Or is it the job of the people who are on the new release team to walk the board, understand what's in their purview, and kind of prep for the status on each of those things, right? And I don't really have the answer yet. Like, yeah. But I think that's one of the cases where it's kind of like easy to see where ownership could transfer over, right? And some of the darker pieces are when someone moves from they may lose interest in a SIG or decide that or a project that they're working on shifts their focus over to storage instead of Node, or what have you, right? Where the things that they're assigned to essentially will bit rot because they're no longer actually working on those things, right? And it's kind of easier, it's kind of harder to see where that shift happens, right? Because there's no well-defined, like, okay, well, you work on this project from X to X date, like the release team has. So yeah, there's lots of work to be done. I think we do need more people in more places. I think that's the first thing that we as a project have to tackle. So
big thumbs up, +1, etc., etc. I got a drop, unfortunately, but thanks for sharing. Thanks for running the meeting and all the great thinking on this. I think we're going the right direction. It's just in some ways the project is getting out from under us a little bit. We need to rein it back in and figure out how to strategically apply effort so that we get it on the right track again.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that we can have more of these valuable conversations in person for Barcelona. I'm excited for that. That's going to be that's one of my top priorities.
I hope I can make it. I've got 3 day 0 events, so we'll see.
Yeah. The Barcelona schedule already looks rough, but all right, I'll let you run.
Yeah.
And Claire and Ihor, if you questions, comments, concerns, things you want to keep chatting about, or we can get time back.
Yeah.
Not yet from you.
Yeah,
The only thing that I'd like to discuss is that we still have our charter independent state. Probably nobody of us has enough cycles to run that immediately.
Yeah.
Was it considering putting that on the table for Barcelona and finishing that around that time?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I had in mind too. I was hoping, so my schedule at least is pretty much booked with one presenting and then doing track talks, track hosting duties, and so I'm hoping that we can use the SIG PM time. One, I'm hoping that like I can draft something while I'm flying or something like that, and have something on ready to go for Barcelona. So we're doing review as opposed to creation by that point.
Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Basically, I was asking not about like writing the charter in Barcelona, but about having the discussion and finalizing it, as we should have something like in the draft.
Yeah, but I think that in the last few months, a lot of really interesting, like not new problems, but problems that have officially come to a head, definitely like issue triage and definitely like project management and things like that
exactly,
have popped up
exactly.
that are significantly like these are like the embodiments of what the charter would be. So I think that it's cool that we're having these discussions now, and I think that those discussions will inform what we're going to write down.
Yeah. So. Yeah, Sarah Claire, go ahead.
Oh, Claire, you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say I didn't have too much data. I agree with most things. I think the only other thing that I was sort of thinking about is when people are talking about how like deadlines creep up on them, and you don't really like officially announce the enhancements freeze until about 4 weeks out of it, since it's week 4 of a given release cycle. It makes me wonder if maybe as we're ending one release cycle, should we start pinging people about like things they want to land in one, like the next release earlier, and say, hey, we don't have dates, but like, this is coming. So maybe if you have things for 1.16, you should already get started on it so it doesn't sneak up on you.
Yes, and I totally agree. So if you check out that, I don't know if did I actually post that thread? Yeah, wait, no, I didn't. Don't think I did. Oh, it's in the agenda, but I'll post it in Zoom chat too. So one of my first responses to, or my only response so far, I owe another response to that, is the fact that like, yes, we should have something that's happening beforehand, but also, hey, you do know this is coming, right? This is not like the deadlines are always about a month out from the start of the release cycle, right? That's basically where enhancements freeze is. So it's not that's not new to the process. So people should be able to kind of map this. Like every release is about 3 months long. The first month of that release is when we need to land these things, right? But part of what I was saying is I think that as code freeze hits, that kind of lends itself to maybe we start looking at like a SIG planning event, right? So like, what do we want to try to accomplish for that release? So exactly what you're saying, like, what do we want to try to accomplish for that release? What do we have in flight? What keps are in flight? All of this stuff, and start, because if those things, the earlier those things come in, when people like the media ask us, like, what is the roadmap for Kubernetes? Like, I don't know what the roadmap for Kubernetes is. Like, it's going to change every cycle, and that's because like the things that we execute on very close to the time that they are quote unquote due, right? If these things were happening earlier and earlier, like if we were able to push enhancements freeze up, right? Yes, more pressure, but that means like, okay, well, you should start planning earlier in the previous cycle, right? And like having these planning events, I think will enable people to go, oh, well, this is what we're targeting. Like, just looking at looking at, take a cluster lifecycle, like, okay, well, obviously we're going to iterate on more kube-adm things. We're going to work on cluster API. There's some things that we want to land there. We want to make sure the integration paths look good for that stuff. On the SIG cloud provider side, it's like, hey, we want to make out of tree cloud providers happen. Right. So, that immediately, like looking at their, looking at the Kubernetes cloud provider repo and looking at their issues, I can easily read through their P0s and know, okay, they want to get docs done for cloud providers. They want to do more work in staging legacy cloud providers. They want to start looking at API throttling for different controllers, and what else? Some work around out of tree CSI. Right. So like I know all of that off the top of my head because I was able to read their stuff, and I know exactly what, like all of their keps are well written. They're in like mostly up, like if not all on time. Right. So it's like it's easy to glean what their themes are just by having a quick look at that stuff. Right. So the idea is if we can do that for every SIG, or if every SIG can start to do that and do that earlier, then it's less of a problem. We can start to like formulate this roadmap, or at least themes for what the release is. So it's no longer a question when the media comes to us, or when a different SIG comes to us, right? Or planning for the next few cycles, we can start to do things like that. So I know a lot of it is pipe dreamy right now, but I've got my fingers crossed for the next few cycles. So thank you, by the way, for just keeping things on track in general. I think that the release team lead stuff is just like a phenomenal amount of effort all around, and appreciative. So
Yeah, no worries.
cool. All right, well, 10 minutes back for us. Looks like we're the only ones left. All right, take it easy, Claire.
Bye.